The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dimly lit lounge, but inside, the air was thick with a different kind of storm. Elena sat on the velvet sofa, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, while Julian stood just a heartbeat too close. He wasn't her husband. That was Mark, the man who provided the sprawling house, the security, and the quiet, comfortable life she had always claimed to want. But Julian was the man who made her forget how to breathe. As he leaned over to set his drink down, the sleeve of his jacket brushed against her bare arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolting spark through her that made her pulse hammer against her ribs. She looked up, intending to offer a polite excuse to leave, but the words died in her throat. His eyes weren't just looking at her. They were reading her, stripping away the polished layers of the perfect wife she played so well. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged with the weight of everything they hadn't said over the last few months. "You're trembling, Elena," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum right under her skin. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin of her wrist, right where her heart was thudding erratically. He leaned in closer, the scent of cedar and rain clinging to him, until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. It was a magnetic pull, a dangerous gravity that threatened to upend the stable world she had spent years building. She knew she should pull back, mention Mark's name, or walk into the other room where the safety of her routine awaited. But as Julian's gaze dropped to her lips and then back to her eyes, the comfort of her marriage suddenly felt like a suffocating cage. Her breath hitched as his hand moved from her wrist to the small of her back, pulling her just an inch closer, close enough to blur the line between a mistake and a choice. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the front door clicked open and the sound of her husband's voice echoed through the hallway. Elena froze, the heat from Julian's hand still searing through the silk of her dress, even as he smoothly withdrew. By the time Mark rounded the corner, Julian was standing a polite distance away, swirling the ice in his glass with a practiced nonchalance. "Julian, didn't realize you were still here," Mark said, his voice warm and steady, the sonic equivalent of a heavy wool blanket. He walked over and kissed Elena on the forehead. It was a gesture of ownership and habit, devoid of the electricity that had just been hummed through the room. Mark smelled of the office and expensive espresso. He was the man who remembered her birthday, paid the mortgage, and never raised his voice. He was safety. He was home. But as Mark began recounting a mundane breakthrough at the firm, Elena's mind drifted to the cracks that had been spreading beneath the surface of their 5-year marriage. Their life was a series of scheduled comforts: Tuesday night takeout, Saturday morning garden centers, and a bedroom where the lights were always turned off by 10 p.m. Mark loved the version of Elena that was content, the one who smiled at dinner parties and kept the house pristine. He didn't know the Elena who stayed awake at night staring at the ceiling, feeling like she was disappearing into the beige paint of their bedroom walls. Julian, an architect Mark had hired for their new summer home, had seen those cracks immediately. Over blueprints and coffee, he hadn't just discussed floor plans, he had discussed desire. "You're too quiet tonight, Elle," Mark said, noticing her distant gaze. He reached for her hand, his grip firm and dry. "Tired?" "Just the rain," she lied, her voice sounding thin to her own ears. Julian leaned against the mantel, his eyes locking onto hers over Mark's shoulder. There was a challenge in his expression, a silent acknowledgement of the charade. A few minutes later, while Mark stepped into the kitchen to take a quick work call, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air grew heavy again. Julian walked toward her, stopping only when the tips of his shoes touched the hem of her dress. "He knows you doesn't see you," Julian murmured, his voice a jagged edge in the quiet room. He reached out, not to touch her this time, but to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, grazing the shell of her ear, sending a fresh wave of vertigo through her. Elena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to scream that he was wrong, but the way her body leaned instinctively toward his touch betrayed her. She felt like a tightrope walker suddenly realizing there was no net. Between the husband who offered a peaceful life and the man who offered a chaotic soul, she was beginning to realize that comfort was starting to feel a lot like a slow death. The following evening, the rain had cleared, leaving behind a thick, humid fog that clung to the windows. Mark was away for an overnight conference, a necessary sacrifice for their future, he had called it during a brief, distracted phone call. Elena stood in the kitchen, the silence of the house amplified by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then the doorbell rang. She didn't need to check the security camera to know who it was. Her body already knew. When she opened the door, Julian was standing there, damp and disheveled, his usual composure replaced by a raw, jagged energy. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the foyer, forcing her to retreat until her back hit the cool marble of the wall. "I tried to stay away," he said, his voice strained, "but watching you play that role yesterday, watching him touch you like you were just another piece of his collection, it nearly broke me." The jealousy in his eyes was a physical weight. Elena's breath came in shallow hitches. "Julian, you shouldn't be here. Mark will be home tomorrow. We have a life." "You have a routine, Elena. You don't have a life." He stepped closer, placing his hands on the wall on either side of her head, pinning her with his presence. The proximity was intoxicating. She could feel the heat of his frustration, the sheer magnetic pull of a man who wanted her, not for her poise, but for her passion. "Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't want to scream every time he asks you about your day with that polite, empty smile." Elena looked down, her gaze landing on Julian's chest, watching the rapid rise and fall of his breathing. Her hand hovered between them, trembling. She meant to push him away, but as her palm landed against his shirt, her fingers instinctively curled into the fabric. The longing she had buried for years surged upward, a tidal wave of forbidden need. Julian leaned down, his lips agonizingly close to the curve of her neck. He didn't kiss her, he simply inhaled, as if memorizing her scent. "One choice, Elena. Tonight, you decide if you want to be safe or if you want to feel alive." The air in the hallway felt like it was humming with high-voltage electricity. Elena's heart was no longer just racing, it was demanding a rebellion. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by the low, rhythmic thrum of Julian's car idling in the driveway, a mechanical heartbeat calling her out of her ivory tower. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, leaving it ajar. It was an unspoken ultimatum. Elena stood in the center of the foyer, her reflection staring back at her from the gilded mirror. She looked like the woman Mark loved, elegant, composed, untouchable, but inside she felt like a glass shattering. Her cell phone buzzed on the console table, a text from Mark. "Flight landed. Miss you. See you in the morning. Sleep well, Elle." The word home felt like a heavy anchor, but the open door felt like oxygen. She grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cool, damp night. Julian was leaning against his car, the glowing tip of a cigarette the only light in the shadows. Without a word, she got into the passenger seat. He drove in silence, away from the manicured suburbs and towards the rugged coastline where the city lights faded into a deep, bruising purple. They pulled up to his studio, a converted warehouse overlooking the crashing waves. Inside, the space was raw, filled with half-finished models and the scent of graphite and salt. There were no scheduled comforts here. The floorboards creaked under their weight as Julian led them to the balcony. "I've spent months designing spaces for people to live in," Julian said, standing so close behind her that she could feel the vibration of his voice against her spine. He reached around her, his arms not quite touching her, but framing her against the railing. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face, his eyes dark with a hunger that frightened and exhilarated her. His hand traveled slowly from her waist to her throat, his thumb tracing her jawline with agonizing slowness. Elena's heart thundered. The safety of her marriage was miles away, a fading memory compared to the raw, electric reality of Julian's touch. He leaned in, his lips a fraction of an inch from her lips, the tension so tight it felt like it would snap the world in two. "Tell me to stop," he breathed. "Tell me now, or don't tell me at all." Elena closed her eyes, her breath hitching as she felt his lips finally graze her, and then the sudden sharp glare of headlights swung across the studio walls from the street below. The headlights cut through the darkness of the studio like a blade, freezing them both in a strobe-lit moment of guilt. Elena's heart plummeted. The silhouette of the car was unmistakable, Mark's silver sedan.
He wasn't supposed to be home until morning. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, instantly chilling the heat that Julian had ignited. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Julian, he followed me." Julian didn't flinch. He didn't scramble to hide or offer a frantic excuse. Instead, he stepped back just enough to look her in the eye, his expression unreadable. "Let him come up," he said, his voice eerily calm. The heavy industrial door at the base of the stairs creaked open, followed by the steady, rhythmic steps of her husband. Each step sounded like a gavel hitting a sounding board. Elena stood paralyzed between the two men, the one who represented her past and the one who represented a dangerous future. When Mark stepped into the loft, he didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from Elena's flushed face to Julian's defiant stance. "I knew